Government-backed digital currency. Why you should be terrified. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1. Let's understand exactly how this would work. And I want to be clear. These are not electronic dollars like we see today. A lot of people are confused. They say, oh, a digital currency is no big deal, because that's basically what we have right now with an ATM card and my bank. Wrong. Let's dive into the details. It starts with the Federal Reserve, and they create Fed coins. So the Fed coins, how do those get to the people? Well, of course, through MMT. All you have to do is download the app on your phone, and we will deposit the Fed coins onto your phone automatically. So Oblivious Oliver and your friend and family member Fred, of course, love the idea. They download the Fed app on their phone immediately. They get some MMT or helicopter money, UBI, whatever you want to call it. So in this example, there's 6 Fed coins that are created. Oblivious Oliver gets Fed coin 1, 2, and 3. Your friend and family member Fred gets Fed coin X, Y, and Z. Oblivious Oliver goes over to your friend and family member Fred's house and sees that he has the most amazing book in the world. That is right. And on the cover of this book, none other than Paul Krugman, your friend and family member Fred's favorite economist. And this book, for some reason, is named We Live in Strange Times. Ah, yes, I know the reason. Because every single time you turn on one of my videos, Krugman's ad pops up. I can't stand it. Editor, cut to the clip.
We live in strange times.
Obviously, I do not pick the ads for my own YouTube videos. That's for sure. The guy pops up everywhere. It drives me crazy. So Oblivious Oliver says, Fred, listen, I have to have that Paul Krugman book. It is amazing. I will give you one of my Fed coins. Fred says, okay, fine. I've read the book 46 times. I believe in it wholeheartedly. I already have Krugman's poster up on my bedroom wall. You can have the book. So they trade. The book goes over to Oblivious Oliver, and Oliver gives Fed coin number 1 to friend and family member Fred. Well, what happens on the ledger of the Federal Reserve or the government? Well, this transaction is noted. So first, they know that Oblivious Oliver got Fed coin 1, 2, and 3. And they know Fred got Fed coin X, Y, and Z. So the third transaction is for the book. So the transaction is between Oblivious Oliver and Fred. Fed coin 1 is transferred over to Fred for the book. Everything is on the ledger because each Fed coin has its own serial number. It can be tracked. It is code just like Bitcoin. This is what you need to understand, and this is the main thing that differentiates it from an electronic dollar. And we'll get into how to think about this in just a moment. So that transaction takes place. So now you understand how every single transaction in the economy would be traced. But it gives the Fed and the government far more power than just being Big Brother. As an example, currently when the Fed does QE, as you guys know from watching my videos, they create bank reserves. In this case, those reserves would of course be Fed coins. So the Fed coins would go into the reserve accounts of primary dealer A, B, and C. But since these Fed coins now have a code, the government or the Fed can determine how each individual coin is used. In other words, it can pre-program the type of loans that the banks give out into the real economy. So as an example, let's say they allocate a specific amount of bank reserves for green energy, or maybe it's for shale oil production. Just want to make sure I piss off everybody. Or it's allocated to politically correct mortgages. And this is going to be a theme throughout the video. So what happens is Primary Dealer Bank, or any of the banks under the Fed's umbrella, they have additional reserves. So they can lend against those reserves. So they go into the real economy, and PC Caitlin, politically correct Caitlin, wants to buy a house from seller Steve. Good news. Caitlin fits the category that the Fed coins have been programmed for. So she goes to her local bank and says, I need a loan for 100,000 Fed coins. The bank says, no problem. We'll go ahead and create brand new Fed coins just for you to buy the home. And of course, they're backed up by the reserve Fed coins that have been pre-programmed or coded for that specific intent. The whole process is identical to the way it works now. The commercial banks are still in charge of creating additional money supply in the real economy. The only difference is instead of using electronic dollars, they're using the now encrypted or coded Fed coin. Also notice each one of these transactions show up on the Fed or the government's ledger system. The transaction between Oblivious Oliver and family member Fred, and the transaction going to politically correct Caitlin and seller Steve. It's all on the ledger. The takeaway for step number 1 is electronic dollars we use now are a lot like a scoreboard at a basketball game. They just show a number that's in each person or each entity's account. Where the Fed coin, or the government-backed digital currency that we'll most likely have in the future, is more like a video game. It's programmed, it's software, and it has a specific job, and it can be tracked everywhere around the world with every single transaction. Now let's go to some awesome subscribers from my email list that are helping me out with today's video.
Step number 2!
Step number 2!
Step number 2! Step number 2!
Government digital currency gives them limitless control. And we're assuming they'll ban cash. I think it's not only inevitable, unfortunately, I think it may be imminent. We have to start by understanding what their goals are. When I mean their, I'm talking about the Fed and government. I see them as one unit in the future. So their goals are to keep asset prices high, interest rates low. I think the Fed's going to be the buyer of last resort. More on that in step number 3. But their main objective is to keep inflation high. Sovereign debt, state debt, consumer debt, corporate debt at all-time highs. They think the best way to get rid of that debt and start from scratch is to inflate it away. There are 3 main metrics the Fed uses now to determine what inflation is going to be in the future. First is their BS, or their balance sheet. Currently, they have total control over this metric. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart. From now on, when we look at the Fed's balance sheet, I think we might as well just call it the hockey stick, because it is going vertical. That is for sure. Currently, there are 2 other metrics they have a lot less control over. Number 1 is M2, broad money in the system. Number 2 is the velocity, so how quickly the money circulates in the real economy. Let's look at a couple charts. First, we'll look at M2 money supply going back to 1985 all the way to 2020. Starts on the left at 2 trillion, goes all the way up to $18 trillion. It starts off rather flat, and then right about 1995, it goes up at a much different trajectory. And then at the GFC, it starts going parabolic, but nothing compared to what it's done over the last month. It's gone up by almost $1 trillion in the last 4 weeks. Absolutely staggering. To put that into context, from 1980 to 1986, 6 years, it went up by $1 trillion. And we've done that just in the last 4 weeks. Moving over to the chart of velocity, starts in 1960, goes all the way to today, goes from 1.4 up to 2.2. Before 1980, around the late 70s, it looks like, pretty darn consistent, going up and down, but just between 1.8 and maybe 1.68%. So down, up, and then pretty flat. And once we get to the late 70s, when inflation really gets out of hand, that's when velocity starts to spike. But Volcker comes in, jacks interest rates almost up to 20%. That decreases velocity. But then in the 90s, it really goes through the roof. It peaks out a little after 1995. Since then, it's done nothing but go straight down to where we are today at an all-time low around 1.4. We know from step number 1, the Fed and the government would have total control over how you spend your money. They would be able to guide spending in the real economy. They'd also be able to control the amount of credit in the system and who that credit was going to. If they can control the credit in the real economy, that means they can also control M2 money supply. They would also have control over the Cantillon effect. What is that, you may ask? Well, let's go to the AustrianCenter.com to check it out. The so-called Cantillon effect describes the uneven expansion of the amount of money. If a central bank pumps more money into the economy, the resulting increase in prices do not happen evenly. The Austrian economist Friedrich von Hayek compared this monetary expansion with honey. If you pour honey into a cup, it won't spread evenly. It kind of clumps up in the middle before it spreads out. Same thing with money. In the case of monetary expansion, the ones who profit from it are the ones who are close to the money. Close to the money in this case means anyone who can access the money right at the beginning, i.e., big companies and banks. They get the loans, they make the investments. The prices then start to rise, even though the rest of the population has not yet received the new money. This part of the population usually are the people without much money. Nonetheless, they have to pay the higher prices even though they have not profited from the increase of the overall money supply. And they will never profit from it the same way the ones who received the money in the first place, that were closest to the money creation. The result is a redistribution from the poor to the rich. Wow, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? And keep in mind, the gentleman that came up with this concept was an economist in the 18th century. Just as true today as it was back then. So you may be saying to yourself, well, George, that actually sounds pretty good. The Fed could make sure that some of the money or all of the money isn't going to the big banks and the big corporations, just driving up asset prices and creating all these bubbles that would get to the average Joe and Jane in the real economy. But I see it from the other side. I think they would use the new power they had using the government digital currency, the Fed coin, to make sure that the money didn't go into Main Street first. I think they would take the power to make sure that 100% of the brand new Fed coins that were created only went to those people who were connected politically. The corporations, the big banks, whomever is rubbing elbows with the politicians. So it would be even worse than it was before. The Fed coins are created. They go to those individuals or entities who have the political connections first. 100% of the new money that's created. And then Once they've already spent it, it trickles down into the real economy. By this time, prices have gone up, and the average Joe and Jane, their income always lags behind. They're the ones that are holding the bag. Oh, but wait, there is more. Let's not forget about the way they would control velocity in the economy. For more on this, let's go straight to my recent interview with the show American Countdown on Infowars.com.
I think, especially when you combine politics and economics, something like a digital currency fits within what the state would want, because it empowers them to an extraordinary degree, and they could have every justification for it. And in fact, our current currency problems that are about to be accelerated over the next year or two would particularly be the pretext for, hey, here's our solution. What do you think about that idea? Is there a possibility of that occurring, and how much of that is a risk versus, say, a national digital currency?
I definitely think it's a possibility because, to your point, it gives governments so much control. And not only from a taxation standpoint, but it also gives them control over interest rates, or the central bank, let's call it. Right now, it would be very difficult for the Fed to take interest rates to like a -5 because people just withdraw their cash. You might be able to go down 50 basis points like they have in some places in Europe. But at a certain point, the general public draws the line and they take their money elsewhere. But with a digital currency, you could not take your purchasing power out of the banking system. In their mind, the way their models work is the way you solve the problem of the business cycle is just by lowering interest rates. That's how you smooth out a recession, is you got to create more demand. Well, the way their models work, and I've never seen them, but I would assume based on their actions, that if you have interest rates at 0, well, if the solution for a recession is to take interest rates from 4%, let's say, down to 0, well, then the solution, if you're already at 0, has got to be to take them to -4. Problem solved.
I see this not only playing out with negative interest rates, but also having a timer on every single Fed coin. Let's assume there was MMT, UBI, helicopter money, whatever you want to call it. Every single American gets 1,000 Fed coins per month. The trick, though, is you have to spend the money by the end of the month. There's a timer on each coin, and if you don't spend it fast enough, then it just disappears. Also, if the Fed saw that the velocity was a little too low, they could just decrease the timer. So let's say they give you your 1,000 Fed coins, and usually it expires, or they expire by the end of the month. Well, they could say now they expire in the next 3 days. So everyone goes out, spends their Fed coins immediately. That increases velocity, therefore increases the rate of inflation.
Step number 3. Step number 3.
Step number 3.
The government digital currency endgame. If we continue to build our economy on asset bubbles, debt, and confidence, and we continue with this obsession with PC culture in the United States, this is how I see it playing out, potentially. This isn't a prediction. This is what I think the possibilities are 5 years, 10 years down the road with the Fed coin. It goes back to the Fed and the government needing asset prices to stay high, interest rates low, and a high rate of inflation. So the Fed and the government are the buyers of last resort. How does this work? Let's say the stock market is at 3,000, the S&P. That's the floor that the Fed wants to set. That's where they have a Fed put. So at the time when the S&P is at 3,000, let's say Boeing is at $100 a share, Apple $200 a share, and Ford $10 a share. A year later, let's assume the S&P goes to 3,500. Well, the Fed and the government would just move up the Fed put to 3,250. $50. So if you're someone that has stock, let's say you own one share of Apple and the price is $200, but there are no buyers in the market, of course, the Fed will step in and buy your stock and give you 200 Fed coins. So you get the 200 Fed coins and your stock goes onto the balance sheet of the Fed. Same exact process with someone who owns a home. Let's say they're trying to sell it for $100,000. There are no buyers, no problem. Go ahead and sell it to the Fed. They'll give you 100,000 Fed coins and your house goes onto the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve / government. You may be saying to yourself, yeah, George, I get it, but is that even possible? Is that even legal for the government or the Fed to come in and just buy all these assets to set a floor on the price? Well, to dive into that further, let's go to a clip from a recent interview of mine with free speech and constitutional lawyer Robert Barnes. How do you think this plays out as far as banning cash? And from a legal standpoint, is there anything in the Constitution that that gives people, Americans, the right to not only use cash but to have their transactions done in a private manner?
There's like the legal theoretical definition of what is the scope of the power of the government to control the means and medium of interchange and exchange. Can they ban Bitcoin? Can they ban cash?
Or my next question on that, Robert, was can they confiscate gold?
Exactly. We have, unfortunately, the example of FDR. So FDR, after he got elected, I think it was within a year or thereabouts, said, hey, everybody's got to bring their gold back in. If anybody's caught with gold, bad things are going to happen. So there's always a risk. Now, there was a fair number of people that did not do so. They estimate somewhere like 10 to 15%, and they weren't able to really track him down. And there weren't a lot of high-profile arrests because at the time he was doing it, there was serious doubts about whether he could do it. Now, no surprise.
Constitutional standpoint.
Absolutely, constitutionally. Okay. And once again, it's the courts turned a blind eye because this was the crisis of the Depression. So nobody was going to meaningfully contest because what he was doing was depriving people of their property without just violation of law. So and without any meaningful due process, without showing how was it necessary to take away someone's gold to protect some other compelling public interest. The analysis in constitutional law here in the States is if you're violating someone's core constitutional rights, the government has to show a compelling public interest and that the means they've chosen to protect that compelling public interest is narrowly tailored to it. A lot of what's happening currently in the pandemic is not narrowly tailored remedies. The seizure of gold was not a narrowly tailored remedy. But we live in an environment where the New York governor has suspended anti-bribery laws, suspended gift giving to politician laws, suspended transparency laws about state contracts, all in the name of the pandemic. It's like, how exactly are the two correlated? Only a politician would think best way to solve this pandemic is we got to get rid of these anti-bribery laws. Then we'll be able to solve it, no problem. So it's that kind of dynamic. So is there a risk of currency seizure or them prohibiting the use of certain things as mediums of exchange? No doubt. Their ability to enforce that constitutionally is still an open question. Their ability to do so practically is probably the bigger question.
So even if it was against the law, they'd simply change the law or ignore the Constitution altogether. As Robert puts it, they'd simply look the other direction. But what about small and mid-sized businesses? How would the government and the Fed prop those up? Well, as an example, let's use Joe's Cafe. Joe, unfortunately, isn't doing well, and you can tell he's extremely bummed out. He is stressed because he's losing a lot of money. But Joe has a social score of 10, which is very good. It's a scale of 1 to 10. Joe has been a very good boy. He's played by all the government's rules, explicit rules and implicit rules. How would a social score actually work? Well, let's go over some things that would most likely reduce your social score. And remember, we're using Fed coins right now. These are not electronic dollars. They're just like a video game or a robot. They can be programmed to do whatever the government or the Fed wants them to do, and they can be tracked with every transaction anywhere in the world at any time. Very crucial you remember that. So going back to the social score, well, if you went out and bought too much alcohol, or what the government deems to be too much alcohol, of course, that would lower your social score. What if you went out and bought a gun, or maybe you bought gold or Bitcoin? Of course, only criminals would want to do that. Your social score would definitely come down. Or if you went out and criticized the Fed's ledger or said anything bad about the government, social score got to come down for that. Let's say you get caught speeding, or on social media you get banned from a certain platform, or even worse, let's say you get blocked on Twitter by one of the political elites. Your social score definitely going down. You see how this would all start to work. Because the Fed owns all the debt, meaning all the loans, SBA loans, auto loans, home loans, the banks would originate them, but they would go straight to the Fed's balance sheet, just like we do right now with mortgages and Fannie and Freddie. Since all the debt would go onto the Fed's balance sheet, it doesn't matter if the debt is paid back or not, because the Fed doesn't have a profit and loss. They create as many Fed coins as they want. So someone gets a loan not based on their ability to pay it back. Absolutely not. That would be complete discrimination, of course. They would strictly get the loan based on their social score, whatever they wanted, whether it was a business loan, auto loan, home loan, student loan, you name it. It all starts with the social score. Going back to Joe's business that's really struggling, the Fed and the government don't want him to go bust because he's got a great social score. So what do? They simply program the Fed app that's on Oblivious Oliver's phone, Fred's phone, and of course, politically correct Caitlin. So then their Fed coins can only be spent for the next 3 days, let's say, or the next week or the next month. They can only spend their Fed coins at Joe's store. Of course, this brings in a lot of money and gets Joe back into the black to where he is profitable. This is the way the Fed and the government would make sure that no one ever loses money. Nobody has to worry again. We've got a system, an economy that's set up the way it should be, based on a social score and not based on merit. And all of this is possible because we're on a government-backed digital currency. Now you may be asking yourself, yeah, George, but man, if they're buying all these assets, all these loans, propping up businesses with the Fed coins, isn't that going to create a ton of inflation? Not at all. Problem solved. For that, we go straight to the MMT playbook. Because the federal government is just spending these coins into existence, it's not part of the Fed anymore. They don't have to sell bonds or debt. Then to lower the money supply or reduce the amount of inflation, they just need to get money or Fed coins out of circulation. To do that, they simply raise taxes. Everybody has all their Fed coins on the app. It's on their phone. So the government or the Fed just simply reduce everyone's balance by 20 or 30%, whatever they need to do to make sure there's less Fed coins in circulation to keep inflation under control. Again, central planning at its finest. So what would you do if they banned cash, made Bitcoin completely illegal, if you used it, 10 years in jail, and they confiscated all the gold? What do you do next? Let me know in the comments below. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.